The cart rattled as if every stone in Yorkshire wished to speak. Eleanor Hartwell steadied herself with one hand on the wooden side and one hand on the coil of rope that tethered the cow behind them. The bell at the animal's throat gave a mild, foolish clink at each rut in the road. Wind pushed across the moors and curled under her shawl like cold fingers. Her father hunched in his coat and said nothing. His jaw worked as though he chewed a prayer and found no words in it. The ribbon in Eleanor's hair held fast. The blue faded but true. Aunt Margaret had tied it that morning with quiet hands and a steady gaze. "Stand as if you chose to come," the aunt had said. "Keep your chin, count your breaths. When they laugh, count to 4. When they whisper, count to 8. When they are silent, speak only what cannot shame you." Eleanor counted because counting had weight. 1 for the beaten track, 2 for the unknown, 3 for the cow's bell, 4 for the aches she would not let show. She had washed the plain muslin until it shone, and had stitched the seam by her wrist where the cloth had frayed last winter. Her gloves, mended twice, hid the calluses at the base of her fingers. Those small scars told the truth of her life. Milk at dawn, hay at dusk, arithmetic learned by candle with the vicar's widow sounding out Latin gently in the back room. The village drew itself up to see them pass. Women stood in doorways with shawls tight. Men leaned on barrels. A boy imitated the cow's bell until his mother cuffed his ear. An old vicar lifted 2 fingers in a blessing that drifted like a leaf and fell between the cart and the wind. Eleanor kept her gaze level. She noted every face to keep from seeing what they made of her. Ahead, the road crooked, then climbed. Ravensfeld Castle rose with the hill. Grey stone set against the sky like a jaw that would not soften. Windows watched. The gate's iron teeth were up. Smoke from the hall chimneys pulled a dark ribbon through the November air. The land seemed to draw a breath and hold it. Her father glanced at her, then away. "You look neat," he said. It was all he had. "Thank you, father," she answered. She did not ask if he was sorry. She already knew. In the nights before, when the ledger men had come, and the rent and tithe had marched them into a corner, his shoulders had narrowed under the weight of sums he could not alter. A cow had become the difference between winter and hunger. A cow and a daughter who could read. The cow blew steam into the world, gentle, untroubled. Eleanor envied her the simplicity of hunger and hay. She did not envy the bell. As they reached the outer court, the cart wheels dragged in the wet. A steward ran forward, his coins clinking as he jogged, and spoke to the drover who had walked behind all the way from the lane. The man took the halter and corrected the animal's course with a tug meant to look like care, but practiced as habit. Eleanor's father set the brake. The sound was loud in the open yard. People had gathered. Not villagers now, but those who had been told and those who always knew. A brace of clerks with their quills and sand. 2 footmen in green livery trying not to smirk. 4 ladies in trim pelisses under fur ruffs, their cheeks pink with weather and interest. One of them, lovely and keen, watched Eleanor's every small motion, like a hawk setting the habits of a hare into memory. She moved her fan in a slow half-circle and spoke low to her companion, and laughter moved between them like silk. A man of middle years waited nearest the gate with a smile that did not belong to his eyes. His coat was black, his cravat crisp. He held a ledger against his ribs as if it were a promise he liked very much. "Mistress Hartwell?" His voice had a pleasant polish. "Eleanor," she said, because he would use her surname to make her small. "I am Eleanor, Councillor Osric Vale," he returned, with the briefest bow allowable for the low. "We are honoured by your presence." He glanced at the cow, the way men glance at a flaw in glass. "And the consideration is, sound. Excellent." Her father made a sound that might have been a breath or a protest. Eleanor could not tell. She curtsied as Aunt Margaret had taught her, not too deep, not too quick. The wind lifted the edge of her shawl and gave it back. The bell chimed a small, foolish note. Eleanor swallowed and felt the ribbon at her wrist bite her skin. "Your name will be entered in the compact," Osric continued, turning to snap his fingers at a clerk. "Age 20, parish of St. Jude's. Dower," he paused, letting the word rest in the open air. "In kind." The clerk dipped his quill. The lady's eyes gleamed. One of them covered her mouth with her glove as if to stifle a yawn, and in that false sleep, the laugh stretched longer. A footstep sounded under the gate. The air thinned as it does when winter sharpens. The men straightened without meaning to. The ladies gathered themselves into better lines. Eleanor's father pulled off his cap and pressed it against his chest. A tall figure stepped from the shadow of the portcullis into the pale light. Prince Adrian of Ravensfeld, so the broadsheets called him. People said his temper was a blade that cut inward as often as out. Eleanor looked up and felt her breath meet a wall and find a way around it. He was not handsome in the easy way of painted miniatures. The bones of his face had been carved with a strict hand. His mouth was shaped to rest, not to smile. His hair, darker than the stone behind him, had refused a perfect arrangement, and a lock lay near his brow as if he had run a hand through it and had been made human by that small disorder. His eyes were a grey she had seen in winter water under a pewter sky. He looked at the cow first. The faintest contraction crossed his jaw. Then he looked at Eleanor. He did not look for long. He did not look away as if she were nothing, either. His gaze held hers with a steadiness that was not kind and not unkind. It was measure. It was a mark made by a carpenter's square held against a new board. He glanced at Osric. Something unreadable passed beneath his restraint. "Your Highness," Osric said with courtesy fine as lace. He almost said it. "The price. The bride has arrived. The bride has arrived," the prince repeated. He did not engage with Osric's smile. He did not acknowledge the bell. He did not ask Eleanor if she had come of her own will, or if she knew what awaited her. He let the iron weight of the words drop between them all. Then he stepped closer. Protocol scraped against humanity for a heartbeat. Eleanor curtsied. He inclined his head a fraction. The winter light showed the shade beneath his eyes as though he slept poorly or read late. "Welcome to Ravensfeld," he said. His voice was lower than she expected. Not sharp, but the kind that could cut if sharpened. "You will be shown to your rooms." Osric's ledger came up like a shield. "We have a few formalities yet, Your Highness. Nothing burdensome." He smiled at Eleanor as if soothing a horse. "Just an entry, a witnessing—" The ladies rustled closer, a flock of bright-feathered interest. The one with the keen mouth, with hair like chestnuts and eyes bright with intelligence sharpened to a point, tilted her head. "Surely we must witness," she murmured to her friend. "One cannot buy a cow without checking its teeth." Eleanor heard it. The friend's laugh hit air and froze there. Her father flinched. The cow chewed and blinked and made a huff that steamed and vanished. The prince's cup of patience tilted, but did not spill. He spoke without looking at the ladies. This should not be a spectacle. He had said it to no one and everyone. Osric's smile did not change. "The law insists upon clarity. A compact is a compact. Our clerks must be precise." The clerks bent their heads as if their quills had weight. One began to read phrases in a steady fix of tone that had surely been taught in some small room full of young men eager to please the powerful. On the 10th day of November, in the year 1791, the party of the first part. Eleanor kept her jaw and her spine. She listened. She refused to let the words strip her of personhood. She was not the party of any part. She was Eleanor. The prince moved his eyes toward her again. At the same moment, a small gust pushed under the gate and lifted a stack of loose papers on a side table. They scattered like white leaves across stone. A clerk lunged. A valet ran, too quickly for mere paper. In the jumble, a single sealed letter slid in a neat line and rested against the toe of Eleanor's boot. The wax bore a crest she did not know, and the top edge had been scorched, as if it had lived in a pocket when a candle had fallen, or a fire had been stoked too high and too heedlessly. She bent and picked it up. The wax was old and unbroken. The paper had a smell like almonds and ash. The valet reached her with a bow that hid his haste. "Forgive me, miss." He extended his hand with the humility of someone who did not mean it. Eleanor did not hold the letter long enough to force a question. She placed it into his palm and watched him carry it to the prince. Adrian's eyes, cool as slate, noted it and the scorch. He took the letter into his own hand and held it a breath longer than courtesy required. Then he slid it into his coat. Eleanor's father had not moved his cap from his chest. His knuckles were pale. He stared at a point somewhere near the prince's shoulder, as if a different choice might step out from behind it if he stared hard enough. "What shall we call you?" one of the ladies asked with sweet venom. "Eleanor, was it? Or will you take a style, the Duchess of Dairies, the Countess of Cream? Heat ran up Eleanor's neck and into her cheeks, then ran away. She kept her face as still as she could. She heard Aunt Margaret's voice as clearly as wind under a door. You cannot stop them breathing. You can decide how you will breathe. She drew a breath, counted to 4. You may call me Eleanor, she said, and made it plain, and let it sit. The prince's gaze slid to the lady who had spoken and held there. It was not a reprimand. It was a notice of existence, like the laying down of a glove on a table. The lady's smile shrank by a finger width. Osric gestured to the nearest clerk. Proceed. Names, dates, sums, the cow's age, the cow's yield, Eleanor's age, Eleanor's parish, her father's arrears. The way the air changed when that word was spoken told Eleanor it had been put in for that very reason. To make the court taste the shape of poverty and spit, if they wished. She kept her eyes forward. She did not look at her father then. To do so would have crushed something in both of them that must not be crushed if either were to go on. The prince's jaw tightened. Strike the arrears, he said, the words flat as slate. This is not a cattle auction. Osric's smile wavered a fraction. The clerk scratched a line through a line. The cow blew another soft huff. The bell chinked. Sign here, the clerk said at last, sliding the ledger. Eleanor took the quill. Her hand did not shake. She had practiced writing her name in every cupboard nook and scrap of paper she could claim from the vicar's widow's generosity. She liked the way the letters linked and the small flourish at the end that felt like a tail on a kite. She wrote Eleanor Hartwell with the care one gives to a single seed in poor soil. The prince took the quill next. He made his mark with no flourish. His name was a fact on a page, nothing more, nothing less. He did not touch Eleanor's hand. He did not need to. She felt the chill of the feather as it passed close to her wrist and thought of the ribbon beneath her glove. The clerk sprinkled sand. Osric shut the ledger with the pleasure of a man for whom a neat closure is delight. He turned already half to the ladies and the idle talk he would charm from them. All in order, your highness. The keen-mouthed lady drifted near Eleanor's shoulder as if to smell the milk upon her. Her voice was honey for bees with sting in it. They say he keeps all his temper in a single ebony drawer, she breathed, soft enough to be almost kind. Do be careful not to open it. Eleanor did not look at her. She looked at the shadow of the portcullis, where the iron teeth waited above like a thought that might drop. A footman, eager to please, glanced to the steward. The steward, whose duties were both written and unwritten, smoothed his coat and smiled in the direction of the prince. There remains the witnessing, he said, and let mischief thread his voice. By the terms, the cow is to be led into the great hall for witnessing. A tremor of laughter stirred the gathered, then tightened into breathless expectation. Prince Adrian stepped one pace forward. His face did not change. His voice filled the cold air, not loud, and yet ending all noise. Open the doors. The hinges complained as the great doors moved, and a breath of warmer air rolled over the court like a mercy that did not touch the bones. Rushes lay new upon the floor, strewn with rosemary to sweeten smoke. The cow balked at the threshold and then, with a patient step, entered the hall. The bell made a meek sound in that large, echoing place. A gallery ran along one wall where servants and minor officers might watch without being seen. They leaned at the rail in a slant of caution and curiosity. At the far end, under the hammer-beam roof, a long table was set with a book open and ink dark in its well. Above it hung the arms of Ravensfeld carved in oak, the stag couchant, the motto beneath stern and spare. Eleanor walked beside the halter, not because anyone told her to, but because the cow knew her hand and would follow it, and she would not see the animal yanked about like a toy for laughter. Her father came 3 steps behind, hat still to his chest, his boots leaving dark marks on the rush. Osric's voice found the timbre of ceremony at once. He liked the way it filled a room. Witnesses of Ravensfeld by the authority vested, we enter into compact on this day. He gestured, and a clerk began a list, as if he were reading out ships at harbour. The party of the first part, His Highness, Adrian of Ravensfeld. The party of the second part, Eleanor Hartwell, age 20, of St. Jude's Parish. Consideration rendered, 1 sound milch cow with bell, age 5, sound of hoof and horn, presently present. A thread of tittering travelled the ladies' line, a bright ribbon of cruel amusement. Eleanor kept her eyes on the table. She noticed details to stay above the water, the ink catch, the sand shaker, the small crack in the wood near the hinge of the book, the sheen on the quill where countless hands had smoothed it by nervous habit. Her breath found its count. "This is indecent," someone muttered in the gallery, then swallowed the words when a steward's glance went upward like a knife. Prince Adrian remained to the left of the table, profile cut against the firelight. The flame showed her again the hollows where sleep had not come. His hand rested on the back of a chair. Every time a laugh tried to rise in the hall, the tendons along his hand stood and the laugh died. "State the terms," he said. Osric did not quite bow. "The lady will be granted residence, protection, and the courtesies." "The wife," the prince said. He did not raise his voice. "Use the word you avoid." Osric's pause lasted the length of a heartbeat. "The wife," he repeated smoothly, "will be granted residence, protection, and the courtesies due. The arrears of the Hartwell holding—" "Struck out," the prince said, "as already noted." The clerk scratched sanded. Eleanor could feel the eyes move over her as if she were a cloth on a bolt, judged for weave and yardage. A lady in an ice-blue pelisse whispered to another behind her fan. "How charmingly rustic. I wonder if the bell will ring when she speaks." The friend's laugh shivered, eager to please. Eleanor perceived the shape of the woman's mouth when it formed mockery. She filed it away. Names, mouths, habits. Aunt Margaret would say knowledge was armor. Osric gestured for the clerk to bring the book. The man set it upon the table with care and turned it toward Eleanor first, as if to display a trophy. "Sign, if you please, mistress. Pardon, my lady." The correction cost him a flake of pride. It fell and lay dull on the rushes. Eleanor took the quill. The ink held a smell like iron and vinegar. She set the point and drew her letters with the steadiness that had been hammered into her by repetition in quiet rooms. The quill did not blot. When she finished her name, she folded her hand back into her glove and moved aside. The prince took the quill. He stood with the posture of a man who had been taught since boyhood to account for his own weight in any room he occupied. He made his mark again without flourish. He did not look up at the gallery, or the ladies, or Osric. He kept his gaze on the line's end, as if the world needed narrowing to not break something within it. He set the quill down. Osric closed the book as if he closed a door on a fine joke. "Witnessed," he said, satisfied, and made a sign to the steward. The steward, swelling with a sense of his own importance, turned to the drover. "Lead the consideration past the table." The cow, obliging as ever, moved forward. The bell made a sound that echoed off oak and stone and vaulted roof. A scatter of applause flared and went out, when Adrian's hand left the back of the chair and came down upon the table with a quiet that travelled farther than any shout. The applause died, as if a palm had smothered it. "This is done," he said. He inclined his head a fraction in Eleanor's direction. "You will be shown to the East Tower. A maid will attend you." His gaze flicked toward a steward. "See that she is accorded respect." The word respect altered the temperature of the air by the smallest shade, like the thickness of an extra shawl. A footman straightened. A clerk cleared his throat and pretended it was smoke. Osric's smile did not slip. He had eaten for years on meals of pride and swallowable insult. "Your Highness is gracious." He stepped nearer to the cow to inspect the hide, as if to salvage some remnant of mirth. The cow used the moment to blow warm breath upon his sleeve. A thin, real laugh escaped from the gallery at that. It died under a footman's cough. Eleanor looked down at her hands, then up at the stag on the wall. She felt oddly separate from the scene, as if she were hearing a story told in a room next to this one, through a wall not quite thick enough. She tried to picture her bed that night. The East Tower. She could not conjure the shape of it. The word wife hummed in her ears like the bell. She stood very still. A boy in livery, too young for his jacket, brought a tray with a cup of spiced wine toward her. It trembled. "For you, my lady," he said, scared to be heard and scared not to be. She took it and said thank you in a voice pitched for him alone. He looked up at her then with quick wonder and darted away with an extra straightness in his spine. She breathed. It was something. A single small stone moved, and perhaps the wall would weaken. The keen-mouthed lady, the one with the chestnut hair and the eyes that weighed everything, drifted nearer, as if she had been tugged by a thread tied to Eleanor's name. She did not look at the cow. She inspected Eleanor the way one inspects a fabric that might yet be turned into a dress suitable for a lesser occasion. Her smile did not quite reach her eyes. The fan moved idly, signaling to those who read such code that she was harmless while meaning the reverse. "Lady Verity Ashcombe," someone murmured near Eleanor's ear, helpful or malicious she could not tell. Verity's voice, when it came, was gentle as down. How quickly the world turns. Her look flicked toward the prince with a private knowledge Eleanor could not read. "May you find your feet before the floor shifts again." Eleanor made the curtsy she had practiced. "I will try," she said. It was the most honest promise she could make. Verity's gaze sharpened at the lack of flutter. She smiled a shade wider. The business of the room resumed in threads. Osric speaking to a clerk, a steward conferring with a footman, servants from the gallery slipping down the far stair in a flow of gossip that would reach the kitchens before Eleanor had crossed the hall. The prince said something low to his captain, a dark, quiet man with a soldier's balance, then stepped back toward the side aisle that led to the private stair. As he passed Eleanor, he paused just enough to be not quite accidental. "The East Tower," he said again, so she would not be left wandering. "Ask for Bryony, she will attend you." He added almost under his breath, this should not have been made a spectacle. She could not think of a reply that would not be too much or too little. She inclined her head and let her eyes meet his for the space of one steady beat. There was something in his look that was not pity. It might have been apology, but shaped into something that could survive being seen. He moved on. The hall shifted to let him pass, like a field of wheat flattened and rising again. Eleanor and her father stepped aside with the cow, waiting for the steward's direction. Her father's mouth worked, then set. He touched her elbow, the briefest brush, as if to assure himself she was solid. "We'll send word," he said, his voice thick. "When we can." She nodded. If she spoke aloud, the sound might break. A draft ran the length of the hall. Loose pages on a side table lifted and settled. The clerk hurried to weigh them with a candlestick. A valet, the same who had been overfast with the fallen letter at the gate, came the other way bearing a sheaf. In his haste, he knocked the corner of the table. Something skittered in a bright arc and landed near Eleanor's shoe with a dry, distinct clink. She looked down. A small key lay on the rushes, brass polished smooth by many touches, with a ribbon frayed to a color that might once have been black. The valet's face emptied for a fraction of a second, then recollected itself. Before Eleanor could move, Verity's fan closed with a whisper, and she leaned in so near that Eleanor could smell violets under winter. Her voice was silk on a knife's edge. "They say he keeps all his temper in a single ebony drawer. Do be careful not to open it." Supper was a parade in which she walked without moving. The great dining chamber glittered with candlelight and plate, mirrors multiplying faces, until the room seemed full of people who were not quite themselves. Eleanor's place was set at the lower end of the long table, near enough to be seen, far enough to remind. The seat card had spelled her new style without flourish, then been turned askew as if by accident. A footman offered wine to the lady on her right, then to the gentleman on her left, then stepped past her glass as smoothly as if it were not there. The tray did not even tilt. Eleanor kept her hands in her lap and looked at the salt cellar stationed one reach beyond her. Its silver sides curled into dolphins that smiled perpetually at someone else. Conversation rose and fell in tidy waves, a tale about frost-bitten orchards in Surrey, a speculation on ices that would be served at the winter ball. Laughter, carefully portioned. Lady Verity, seated 2/3 of the way up, smiled with her eyes lowered, making confidences without words. From time to time, those confidences drifted down the table like feathers and landed near Eleanor light and cold. "Such a mercy that the arrears could be addressed," someone remarked in a voice that could be heard by those who should and those who should not. "How very compassionate a crown can be." "Compassion is nothing if not economical," another replied to general appreciation. Eleanor kept her spine tall and measured her breath. She thought of the vicar's widow correcting a Latin tense with a tap of the finger and a patient smile. She thought of the cow's warm flank under her palm when the January wind laced through the barn boards and made everything else feel far away. A dish of fish came down, pale and fine, dressed with capers. The serving lad, cheeks blotched with effort and fear, set a portion before her so small that it seemed a comment. She thanked him by name. He startled, then managed a grin he tried to swallow. The portion coming to her father's old friend at the far end doubled at once. Small things moved. The cut direct arrived on slippered feet. A gentleman in good cloth approached her end of the table with a lady on his arm. He turned his face perfectly, so that his eyes slid past Eleanor's like water past stone. His companion adopted his angle and did not see Eleanor at all. They took the two empty chairs opposite and sat talking of a garden at Kew, as if the air between them did not contain a living woman. Eleanor felt the skin draw tight across the bones of her face. She tasted iron at the back of her throat and swallowed it. At the head of the table, Prince Adrian spoke little. He did not smile. He listened in a way that made men tighten their stories and women square their shoulders. When the laughter edged closer to cruelty, he set down his fork with a precise note of metal on porcelain that ran the length of the table like a bell no one else could hear. The room corrected itself. It lasted 3 minutes at a time. Each time he tried to eat, someone tried a joke on the topic of cows, and each time the joke died stillborn when it reached his end of the table. The meal took a long time that way. When the sweet was served, Eleanor reached for the salt at last, not because sugar needed it, but because her body wished to prove to itself that it could. Her fingertips brushed the dolphin's tail. The gentleman opposite put his hand very casually on the rim and turned it half an inch farther away, while he laughed at something the lady said. He did not look at Eleanor. Her hand fell back to her lap, as if it had always meant to. She could feel eyes upon the small theatre of that. She did not give them the interest of a flinch. A chill ran up her arms despite the fires. Her shawl lay on her chair behind her shoulders, useless and polite. She finished what she could of the custard and folded her spoon on the edge exactly. The boy with the wine returned, his tray lighter. He made to pass her again, and at the last moment set the decanter at her elbow without looking up. It was the smallest of rebellions, and it made something move in her throat that was not weeping. She poured for herself, half a finger's worth, and drank it as if it were a sacrament administered by a church that had forgotten her, but had at last recollected. Prince Adrian stood. The scrape of his chair did not rasp, it declared. All men rose, all women rustled to a stand. He inclined his head and left the room by the side door. Conversation re-knit itself too quickly, relieved of its check. The laughter lost a layer of caution. It grew soft and then sharper. It began to prick. "Do you suppose she will be taught the minuet?" someone asked. "Or will the cow do instead and pull the floor to the proper time?" "She may have a natural ear," came the answer. "Bells are bells." A bubble of mirth rose, bright and mean. Eleanor set down her napkin. She said to no one in particular, "Pray excuse me," because she had heard women say so when they went to mend a hem or a nerve. She did not wait to be detained. The corridor beyond the dining chamber smelled of wax and old wood, and a faint salt that might have been the memory of sea 100 miles away. She walked without hurry. A steward opened his mouth as if to question her, then shut it again when he met her eyes and stepped aside as if a draught had moved him. She did not look to see if anyone watched. The door to the garden gave when she tried it. Cold air came in as if let out of a chest where it had been stored for this purpose. Outside, the world had been pared to essentials. The south garden lay in ordered beds, rimmed by box hedges, all the greens turned black in the dark. Frost limned the tops of the clipped walls and spiked each blade of grass with a pin of light. The sky was low and grey, a sheet-iron dome. Her breath declared itself before her and then vanished, like a thought she could not quite keep. The stone balustrade along the terrace bound itself in cold so profound that when she touched it she felt heat leave her hands in a rush, as if the stone had taken a tithe. She walked to the railing and set both palms to the stone and let the pain deliver her back to herself. Tears came then, not loud, not violent, but with the quiet persistence of a thaw that will carve a valley if given time. She did not dab at them. She let them mark their paths. She thought of the ribbon at her wrist under her glove and pressed her thumb to it until the edge bit. "Breathe," the memory of Aunt Margaret said. "Your lungs are yours. Breathe." She drew air in, slow, to 4, held it, let it out to 6. Her heart obeyed the count as a horse obeys a soft hand on the rein. Behind her, the castle's windows burned in rows, careless as constellations. Somewhere inside, a woman laughed as if her throat were made for such sound. Somewhere inside, a servant set a dish down and thought of his mother's hands. Somewhere inside, Osric Vale closed a ledger with the exact same pleasure he took in blowing a candle out with 2 fingers when no one could see him. Eleanor thought of her father's hand on her elbow, brief and sudden, of the boy's decanter, half a finger of wine like mercy, of Prince Adrian's voice when he said wife and respect in a tone that altered the air, of the lad's whisper in the corridor, East Tower, Bryony, of Lady Verity's breath that smelled of violets and the sentence about drawers polished and dangerous. She thought of the letter that had slid against her boot with the scorched edge, of the way the prince had held it for a fraction longer than he had to. She thought of the cow's bell, foolish and brave in equal measure. She thought of shame as a thing like iron. If she allowed it, it would press against her ribs until she could not draw breath. She would not allow it. She could not stop them breathing. She could decide how she would breathe. She wiped her cheeks with her glove and laughed once, very softly, at the helplessness of the sound, because it was better to make it hers than to have it stolen and used against her in some retelling. The laugh vanished into the frost and made no claim. A rose cane brushed her skirt as the wind turned. She looked down at it. Tiny barbs caught on the muslin and let go with the slightest sound. She pictured buds in June, heavy and foolish with scent, and tried to believe in them. The earth kept its promises even when men did not. Her toes numbed inside her shoes. She stamped once, gently. The sound was small on the gravel. Somewhere nearby, a nightbird shifted in a yew and decided the cold was not worth the song. She rested her forehead against the back of her gloved hand on the stone. The skin there was warm from breath and tears. The stone beneath was not interested in either. She let the indifference be a point she could push against. In the quiet, other sounds rose, the soft ticking of frost contracting leaves, the distant thud of a door far inside the castle, the river beyond the south wall, hidden by a fold in the ground, moving as it had moved long before there were titles and ledgers and ladies who folded their mouths around other women's names like sweetmeats. She did not know how long she stood. Time had unstitched itself and laid down in pieces. When the gravel near the path shifted beneath a foot, she heard it at once. It was not the heavy stride of a man who meant to be heard, or the light rush of a servant in fear of being late. It was the measured approach of someone who had followed a thin thread with care, and did not yet know if he would be welcome. A cloak's hem brushed the stone. The smell of wool and cold came with it. Eleanor lifted her head, her tears drying fast on her cheeks, and turned to the shadow that paused a few paces away. A low voice, careful, as if not to startle a skittish animal. Mistress Hartwell. She straightened, dragging sleeve across her cheeks, in a motion that was not elegant and did not need to be. The shadow stepped into a blade of candle spill from a high window. A woman stood there, cloaked in dark wool, face pale from cold and travel, eyes that took the measure of a room and a heart in one glance. Aunt Margaret. Eleanor's breath came out on a sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been the name she had tried not to say since dawn. Margaret opened her arms without ceremony. Eleanor went into them and found, foolishly and immediately, the smell of hearth smoke and lavender soap, and a life in which mornings began with the rattle of the kettle and not with the scrape of quills. "My clever girl," Aunt Margaret said, fierce and low. "You stood. I saw you stand." "I shook," Eleanor whispered into the wool. "Inside. Inside is where you may shake," Aunt said. "Outside is where you will choose. Come. The wind is unkind, and I am old enough to be frank." She took Eleanor's arm as if they were two ladies leaving a card party. Together they went back through the door, across the dim corridor, up a narrow stair the great people would never use. Aunt Margaret moved with the practiced swiftness of one who had learned houses through their bones and not their tapestries. She nodded to a footman in a way that told the footman he had been seen, and in being seen, might be faithful to what he could be. Eleanor's chamber in the East Tower waited with a small fire that had not learned how to be generous. The bed hung with dim damask. The casement admitted a slice of black moor and a smear of frost on glass. A single candle added its fluttering heart to the hearth stammer. A girl of 18 stood at the hearth with tongs, her brow furrowed at a coal that refused sense. She turned when they entered and bobbed a curtsy so quick it was almost a flinch. She had honest eyes and a mouth that told the truth before it thought better of it. "Bryony," Aunt Margaret said, presenting her as if she introduced a duchess. "She will be your hands when you must not use your own. She will listen when the walls have ears." Bryony looked at Eleanor with an open hope that made Eleanor want to be worthy of it. "My lady," she said, and then, perhaps by habit, "Miss," and then flushed. "Forgive me." "There is nothing to forgive," Eleanor said, and meant it. "We will learn one another." Bryony's shoulders loosened. She turned back to the fire with renewed determination. Aunt Margaret untied Eleanor's shawl and draped it over the bedpost. Brisk, practical. Then she sat Eleanor by the hearth and took her hands into her own palms, warming them. The skin of Aunt Margaret's hands was work-soft, not court-soft. "You entered as a bargain," Aunt said, looking into the flames, "because some truths are easier that way. You will leave as a choice. That is the work. It begins now." Eleanor watched the coal catch and hold. "How?" she asked, because the question had lived under her breastbone all day and had bruised the ribs around it. "How does a person make a choice inside a ledger line?" "By naming yourself before they name you," Aunt said. "By setting this very night one rule you will not break for any price they set. Rules are ropes you throw forward. You pull yourself along them." She turned Eleanor's hands to the fire, palms open. "What will be your first rule?" Eleanor thought of the salt cellars turned away, the wine that skipped her, the mouth that did not see her as it passed, the bell that made a fool of dignity. She felt the old ache of wanting to explain, to justify, to plead her personhood to rooms that had already decided their story. "I will not be made sport," she said, surprising herself with the shape the words took when they were allowed air. Saying them put weight into the soles of her feet. Aunt Margaret's mouth tipped at one corner. "Good. The rule has two parts. First, you will not perform your pain for their pleasure. They feed on it. Deny them. Second, you will answer insult the way you would stoop to pick a burr off a hem, calmly and only once." She reached into her pocket and brought out a narrow ribbon, plain and grey. She tied it around Eleanor's wrist, under the glove. The knot sat where pulse beat, a reminder that life continued. "When you feel the flame up your throat, press here. Count before you speak. If you must speak, feed them truth as small as a pill. Do not give them a feast." Eleanor pressed. The bite of the knot steadied her, as if the room had tilted, and then righted. "What else?" "You will know the names of those who will never be announced, and you will say them aloud," Aunt said. "Stewards, footmen, scullery girls, the woman who launders your linen, and the boy who cleans your grate. Those names will help you breathe when the titled forget you own lungs. And when the titled speak to you as to a pet, you will look at their noses, not their eyes. It feels like impudence and reads as attention." Bryony, listening under the business of coal and poker, smiled once at the mention of names and then smothered the smile in a practiced way, as if she knew joy must not be seen by the wrong eyes. "And the prince," Eleanor said, because the shape of his profile against the fire in the great hall had lodged itself in her like a splinter. She did not yet know whether to keep for its reminder or pull for relief. "What am I to him? A mark on a page?" Aunt Margaret's look softened in a way that made Eleanor want to cry again and not let herself. "He was a boy once," Aunt said simply. "Men who grow in stone learn to hold their faces still. Faces like that crack if they smile without trusting the floor. Watch his hands. A man's words can be trained. His hands forget the lesson." She reached to the small table and took Eleanor's gloves and set them on the back of the chair to dry. "He said wife today when others said bargain. We do not make idols of words, but we do collect them and see if their pattern holds." Eleanor nodded. The fire spoke. The house creaked. The wind made old timber remember storms. The world gathered itself and then let go, the way a child breathes after a fright. Aunt Margaret rose and crossed to the washstand. She poured water into the basin and brought a cloth back warm, held over the kettle for an instant, and pressed it to Eleanor's face with a gentleness that made time fold. "You will sleep," she said. "But before you do, we will plot tomorrow." "Plot," Eleanor echoed, because the word warmed her. "What can I plan?" "Small things that look like nothing until they are everything," Aunt said. "At breakfast you will greet the steward by his name, Mr. Preece, and ask after his mother's chilblains. You will thank the footman who brings your tea, Samuel, and you will ask him to set the pot on the stand not near the window because draughts make tea bitter." Aunt smiled a little. "He will tell everyone in the hall that you know tea. The kitchen will decide you are worth their time. Kitchens decide more than kings." Bryony stifled another smile and failed this time. "Today, when the salt was moved," Aunt continued, and Eleanor's head came up because she had not said a word of it, "you did not reach again. Good. But next time, when a hand tries to complete a little theatre, you will alter the play. You will turn to the nearest servant, by name, and ask in your quiet voice if he would place the salt. You will look not at the gentleman who made a picture of you, but at the servant who will make a meal for you. Pictures break when you do not stand where they put you." Eleanor tried the sentences in her mouth and found them possible. It felt like learning a dance by naming each step before moving. She could do that. Bryony had left the hearth and come to stand toward the back of the rug, hands clasped tight against the wish to speak. Aunt Margaret saw her and tipped her chin. "Out with it." Bryony came forward a pace, eyes bright with fear of overstepping, and the stronger fear that the moment to serve might vanish. "Begging pardon," she said to Eleanor, "but I thought you ought to know. At the witnessing in the hall, a key fell. I saw it. The valet went pale just for a blink. No one else marked it, or if they did, they chose not to bend." Eleanor's heart tightened in her chest. The brass glint on rushes, the little clink she had half heard under the murmur. She saw again Verity's face close to hers, the same breath that smelled of violets, the sentence about temper in a drawer that had been crafted to bruise and instruct at once. "What key?" Aunt Margaret asked, flat, as if the word could mean any of 1,000 doors she would happily open with hairpins and patience. Bryony slipped a hand into her apron pocket. She took out a small key on a ribbon, the ribbon's black worn to mouse color where fingers had worried it. The key had been polished by repetition to a dull shine. It was the kind of key that fit a drawer, not a door. It looked like every important thing Eleanor had never been allowed to touch. "I was below in the gallery just after," Bryony said in a rush, "sent to carry napery to the sideboard. The valet was called off and forgot himself. I saw it lying there and I thought better in my pocket than under his boot." She flushed red as if expecting dismissal and clung to her courage anyway. "Forgive me if I have overdone." Aunt Margaret did not scold. She did not praise too quickly either. She looked at the key as if it might bite. Then she looked at Eleanor. Eleanor did not reach for it. She looked at her aunt, and then at Bryony, and then at the key again. She remembered the scorched letter. She remembered the way the prince had held it one breath too long. She remembered the rumor with violets on it. "What do you think it opens?" she asked, and kept her voice level because discovery loves silence more than noise. Bryony swallowed. "The gentlemen speak without seeing us," she said. "The valet was told to lock what should have been locked. He had been called to the private study. The study has a desk of black wood, smooth as a lake. The footman says the drawer sticks unless you know it. And the ladies say—" Aunt Margaret lifted a hand just enough to stop the rest, because repeating a lady's rumor makes it larger. She met Eleanor's eyes over the small brass thing that sat between them all and made a different sort of air in the room. Bryony took a breath and finished in a whisper anyway, as if the sentence had been promised to itself and must be said to keep faith with events. "That key fits the prince's ebony drawer." Morning found her with a plan the size of a teacup and the strength of a rope. Eleanor woke before the bell, watched pale light creep along the leaded panes, and fixed the ribbon at her wrist with a tug that made the knot speak. Bryony's knock came soft as thought. When the girl entered with hot water and a shy glance, Eleanor said good morning first and asked if she had slept. No one at Ravensfeld expected to be asked such things. The question sat between them like a small fire. In the dining room reserved for mornings, the long table had shed its glitter and taken on the business of eggs and bread. Men with lists stood near doors. The steward, Mr. Preece, held a cup between hands reddened by winter. Eleanor went to him. She said good morning, Mr. Preece, with a tone that made the name sound like a thing worth being, and asked after his mother's chilblains, because Aunt Margaret had said the word, and because care multiplies when spoken aloud. He blinked hard, then smiled like a man who has found a coin in a pocket he had thought empty. "Easier, my lady," he said. "A dab of goose fat each night. You are good to ask." "Goose fat is a sovereign salve," she said, as if she had always discussed such things in rooms with damask chairs. He chuckled and moved through the day with his spine a shade straighter. The boy who brought tea tried to leave it near the window. Eleanor, gentle, said, "Samuel, would you be so kind as to set the pot on this table away from the draught? Tea suffers if it is chilled." He flushed with pleasure at being seen and obeyed with the care of a man handling gold. The butter arrived while still a notion of warmth. Bread appeared that had been cut for a human mouth and not for a drawing. The kitchen noticed. Kitchens always do. Aunt Margaret and Eleanor took their seats near the hearth. Several ladies drifted through, their morning caps promising serenity. Verity, in a wrapper of palest green, looked over Eleanor with a kindness so perfectly arranged that it might have been stitched. "How well you take rooms," she said, as if praising a cat for learning not to disturb a cushion. "One would not think—" She allowed the rest to die for lack of company. Eleanor buttered bread. "One learns quickly when one must," she said, and passed the salt by asking a footman to place it using his name. The footman started, then did as asked, with a composure learned in an instant. He would tell the hall would tell the kitchen would tell the world. After breakfast, she asked Bryony to show her the library. Bryony's delight could not be contained by propriety. She led the way with the air of a girl who knows where the sweetest strawberries hide. The library door stood half open, the room beyond lined with silent witnesses in calf and vellum. Winter light pooled in the tall panes, cold and clean. A portrait of a woman with steady eyes watched from over the mantel. Near the window, a man stood with one hand braced on the sill and the other at his temple, as if holding thought in place. He did not turn at once. He did not need to. The room arranged itself around him. "Your Highness," Bryony breathed and vanished with a curtsy, retreating fast enough to be invisible. Eleanor stood where she was. The prince lowered his hand, then looked over. A faint line pleated between his brows, as if light did not always agree with him. "I have made an enemy of the morning," he said, dry and almost amused at his own expense. "Forgive me. The light and I quarrel from time to time." "Then invite Mint," Eleanor said, before caution quite caught up with her. "A sprig in hot water. It will not take offence, and it will persuade the light to be a little gentler." The pleat eased. "Mint," he repeated, as if the word were a tool whose use he had not considered. "We have mint." "In the kitchen garden, I expect," she said. "If not, the cook will know where to plunder some from a neighbour with more than he wants. Mint spreads." A corner of his mouth thought about lifting and decided in favour. "You are acquainted with invasions." "Only the botanical sort," she answered, and the room remembered how to be easy for one breath. He gestured to a print on the wall near her, fine lines etched into paper, browned at the edges with years. "Do you like Holbein?" he asked. She looked. The study of a girl's hand, a face drawn in a few strokes that saw everything and made only what mattered. "I like how he refuses to flatter the skin," she said. "It is a kindness to the soul." He inclined his head, not so much agreeing as acknowledging a sentence that had not insulted the print. "You read Hans?" "When they tell the truth," she said. Her own. She folded at her waist because they had told too much last night. Silence lived between them, not hostile. He moved to the small bell rope and pulled it. When a footman arrived, he said, unadorned, "Mint, boil water, bring it here." And then, after a beat, "And to the East Tower, too." The footman went with the briskness of a man relieved to have a task that could earn approval without becoming politics. Eleanor's pulse considered a new pace and declined. She nodded and let her gaze run along the spines nearest. Books of husbandry, of weather, of law. A translation of Horace with notes in a tight, controlled hand. She imagined the sound of his quill crossing out a word and replacing it. A shout came from the corridor below. Thin, high, not angry, just the cry of a child whose world had temporarily broken. Eleanor moved without thinking, as if the sound had pulled a string tied to her ribs. She stepped out and down the shallow stairs to the service passage that ran behind the library. A small boy stood there with a broom taller than himself, cheeks wet, one shoe untied, dignity in tatters. "Hush," Eleanor said, kneeling so that the world would stop being a wall. "Will you let me tie it?" He nodded, hiccuping. She took the laces in fingers that had tied knots in rope and hair and hope. "What is your name?" "Tom," he said, braving another hiccup. "Tom Price." He watched her hands like a man being taught a spell. The ashpan tipped and Mr. Priest said, "Mind it," and I did not. "Then you will mind it now," she said, calm as milk, "and your shoe will mind you. Listen." She tapped the bell rhythm softly on the floor with the toe of her shoe. Clink, pause, clink, clink, pause. The cow's patient pattern, the sound of mourning in barns and kitchens. Tom breathed to it without meaning to. His tears forgot themselves. When she finished the knot, she tugged it. There, strong as winter. He scrubbed at his cheeks with a sleeve and tried to bow without dropping the broom. "Thank you, my lady," he whispered. The words a newly learned coin he meant to spend correctly. He ran, already mending the world. Eleanor stood and found the prince at the top of the step, not intruding, only there. He had come as far as his breeding allowed a man to come into a servant passage unless fire or flood compelled it. He had watched without making the moment his. "That rhythm," he said. "What is it?" "A bell I know," she said. "Her sound tells you the day will come whether you fear it or not." He looked past her toward where the child had gone, then made a small motion with his hand, and the footman at the end of the corridor materialized. "Captain Blackmore," the prince said, as a dark man with a soldier's ease stepped into view. "See that extra coal is sent to the Price cottage. Tell Priest I have said so." The captain nodded, eyes flicking once over Eleanor, with the recognition soldiers give one another when they see courage in the wrong uniform. "At once, Highness." Eleanor returned to the library with a breath she had not expected to gain before noon. A tray arrived soon after, the steam rising like hope into cold air. The prince poured without ceremony. He took a sip, then paused, surprised by something simple that had done what complicated things could not. "You are right," he said, as if acknowledging a fair shot in fencing. "We will quarrel with the light less today." She smiled, and let that be enough in that room for that morning. The day bent itself to necessary tasks. Aunt Margaret tugged Eleanor through a series of small, deliberate courtesies that left their marks like pins on a map. Names learned, a thank you here, a straight look there. At noon, Eleanor stood beside the scullery girl, who would hem her shift and asked after her mother's bread. In the afternoon, she passed two ladies on the stair and did not flatten herself against the wall. She made room without diminishing, which is a trick and a creed. Verity watched from a landing the way a falcon observes the air currents it intends to use. Toward dusk, Eleanor sought the small chapel she had seen in passing, drawn by the way old stone keeps a kind of silence that can soothe or accuse. The door gave under her hand, cool and knotty with age. Inside, candles guttered before saints whose faces had lost their paint and gained more sympathy. She sank onto a bench near the wall, where an alcove carved with leaves made a pocket of shadow. Her breath made a cloud she could see. Her bones wanted stillness. She did not plan to pry at the carved stone. It simply looked a little wrong, as if a mason had once put it back so gently that time would pretend not to notice. Her fingers found the least give, the softest seam. She pressed, the way she might test a fruit for ripeness. The stone shifted by a whisper, and then yielded, sliding aside with a reluctance that felt like a secret, changing its mind. Behind it lay a book. The leather was cracked, the clasp broken cleanly, as if it had decided one day to let itself be opened. Eleanor drew it into the dim and set it in her lap. She ran her thumb along the edge and felt the lightest powder of dust, the kind that comes from years of breathing. She opened to the first page and found a hand as neat and controlled as lace, not all loops and flourishes, but a discipline that had been learned and perhaps resented. "I write because I am not permitted to speak." Read the first line. The room shifted around her as if making space. She turned a page with care. The writer called herself by no name at first, as if names had been locked with jewelry in strong boxes. She spoke of a prince who swore something with a hand on a sword, and then cut with the same hand what he had sworn to guard. She spoke of a woman wronged not in the coarse way of taverns, but with papers and seals and the cold of dismissed words. She wrote the word vow as if it were a person who sometimes came when called, and sometimes did not. She did not embellish. She set down history because someone must. Eleanor read until her eyes ached. The light worsened. The letters grew into a grey river her mind had to ford. She found a page where the discipline of the hand faltered. The writer's line emptied, then filled in surges. Here the wronged woman had been told to be grateful for what remained to her. Here the prince had sent gifts that could not atone. Here a promise had been made in a locked room that could not bind in daylight, because the one who spoke it feared the room that would be filled by truth. Eleanor turned another page and found a surname. It sat there like a stone she had carried in her pocket since childhood, and thought ordinary, until someone told her it came from a river that had drowned kings. The name was Northern, spare, and hers, on the side of her mother. It was not Hartwell. It was the other one, the one half the village could not pronounce without swallowing an extra syllable and laughing to hide it. Her heart did something that did not feel like a beat. It felt like a decision that had been made without asking her. She touched the name with a fingertip the way one might touch a grave inscription, not to wake anything, but to remember. The bell in the chapel tower, very small and human, marked the quarter hour. Eleanor shut the book and held it against her, feeling the weight translate along her bones. She should put it back, she should burn it, she should carry it to Aunt Margaret. She should forget she had ever seen it. All of these were true and none possible. She slid the book back into the alcove and drew the stone into place with both hands, fingers finding the groove. The seam dimmed into plausibility. She wiped dust from her gloves and stood. The last of the light had left the glass. The chapel had settled into the kind of dark that belongs to listening. Shoes scraped on the flagstones outside. Close, too close for chance. A slow hand found the latch and tried the door. The latch lifted and fell twice, patient as a cat. Eleanor stood very still beside the bench, palms damp inside her gloves. The door held. Whoever stood outside let a breath cloud the glass, and then waited, listening for movement that did not come. A knuckle tapped the wood, not a demand, but a question. After a moment the steps withdrew not far. She could hear the scrape of a heel at the corner where the vestry passage turned. She slipped along the wall and found the small door that led to the narrow stair, the one a mason had made when the chapel was younger and repairs were frequent. The latch on that door lifted with a tiny, traitorous squeal. She stepped through and eased it down with 2 fingers. The dark took her and gave her back to the corridor, where she walked like a woman who had always known where she was going. By morning, a different kind of day had fastened itself to the house. "A levee, mister," priest said, which translated to standing in a long room and being inspected as if one were fruit at market, only with better gloves. Eleanor followed Aunt Margaret through a maze of corridors until the great hall lay remade in daylight, chairs drawn up, sunlight laying pale stripes across the floor, ladies in morning gowns arranged like petals, gentlemen polishing anecdotes in their heads before they risked them. Verity stood at the center of a small ring, serene in pale lilac, a spray of ribbon at her shoulder that looked like a sigh. She greeted each arrival with a word that felt like a favor and cost her nothing. When she turned and saw Eleanor, her smile warmed by a degree measured by rooms and rumors. "Lady Ravensfeld," she said, tasting the syllables as if to judge their sugared content. "How good of you to rise to mornings. Some women find they are allergic to them." Eleanor curtsied with impeccable accuracy, as if the measure of deference were a dose to be administered, and not a pool in which one drowned. "Mornings and I are old friends," she said. "They used to come in while I milked." A few ladies colored at the word milk, as if life should not be said aloud before noon. Verity's eyes brightened. "How fortunate," she said, voice mild. "We are in need of diversion, until the musicians have tuned for the noon hour. Shall we play a game?" She did not wait for assent. She turned to the cluster of women and men and widened her smile into a hostess's. "Each lady shall name the most memorable dowry she has known," she declared lightly. "Not her own, naturally. We must preserve some mystery. The gentleman may judge which is most distinguished." A murmur of appetite for harmless cruelty stirred. The ladies tilted their heads, calculating what would sound grand without sounding vulgar. A baroness of a certain age announced a casket of emeralds brought from Vienna in a coach with 8 greys. A viscountess countered with Gloucestershire land that made her laugh untroubled at weather. Laughter warmed. The gentleman leaned and murmured. The game gathered itself as all games do that let people handle sharp objects while pretending they are fans. Verity's turn came round with exquisite inevitability. "I once knew a woman," she said, eyes lowered for mercy she did not mean to give, "whose dowry was so admired that it was displayed for days before the wedding. Pearls like moons, a tiara that made women miscarry from envy. The laugh that followed was as gentle as poison in milk. But the most memorable, well, must be the one we all know. A cow, with bell. How endearing that simplicity can feed a kingdom. She raised her gaze to Eleanor as if offering her the coals and the tongs to do her own burning. The room tilted toward Eleanor, like a tray people meant to upset. Aunt Margaret stood aside, the exact distance a woman keeps when another must walk into weather alone. Mr. Priest frowned into his cup and then pretended he had not. Bryony at the edge squeezed her hands together until the knuckles looked like stones. Eleanor felt the knot at her wrist. She pressed it. 1, 2, 3, 4. She drew a breath the way you pull a bucket from a deep well and drink only what you need. She stepped forward enough to be seen, not enough to be performing. When she spoke, it was in the voice she used to soothe a nervous colt and to answer a vicar's question and to tell her father he had done his best. She did not raise it. The room quieted to hear the tone, if not the words. "I have seen dowries that shine," she said. "I have seen land deeds that make men stand taller and women sit straighter. I have seen pearls that look like moons and behave like them too, far and cold." A ripple went through the ladies, some laughing, some not. Eleanor went on. "But I have also seen milk put into a child who had not yet decided to keep living. I have seen wool enough for blankets when the frost would like to lay its hand on a chest and call it finished. I have seen a cow, plain as a bar of soap, pay for seed and keep a field from becoming a story about hunger." A lady near Verity's ring looked down abruptly. Another's mouth softened. Verity kept her smile in place and made it cooler, as if the room had been deucedly warm. "So very improving," she murmured. "Shall we all resolve to be quite pastoral?" Eleanor did not look at her. She looked at the servants' gallery, where a kitchen maid had paused with a basket of linens and forgotten to breathe. "You may jest at what you will," Eleanor said, "but a bell that rings in the morning can feed those who do not attend levees. I do not ask you to admire it, I ask you to admit it exists." Silence held like a held cord. It was not comfortable, but it was harmonic. One of the men, the captain Blackmore, shifted with the ghost of a nod. A gentleman prepared a cutting remark and thought better of it because the room had tilted by a hair, and he did not wish to be the man who slipped first. "Charming," Verity said in a tone that winter wears when it pretends to be spring for a day. "We must be grateful to have so immoral a bride among us. So hungry a winter," Eleanor returned without heat. It was not a retort. It was a sentence with its own weather. Movement at the doorway rippled through the assembled like the first breeze through wheat. Prince Adrian entered with the unhurried stride of a man who neither seeks nor refuses attention. He had put aside the soldier's coat of last night for a morning coat of plain dark cloth, and the change made him look less like a statue and more like a man who has thoughts and cannot always stop them. He looked at Verity's ring the way a teacher looks at chalk before a lesson about why chalk is not a toy. He did not ask what game they played. He did not need to. The scent of it was on the air. "Your Highness," Verity said, curtsying, sweetened into grace at once. "We find ourselves in want of music. I was only obliging with a distraction." "Distraction is plentiful," he said mildly. He looked not at Verity but at Eleanor, not in rescue but in recognition that someone had already done the thing that needed doing. He turned, measured the room, and spoke into the space where jokes are fed. "That will be the last jest at my wife's expense." He did not raise his voice, he did not need to. The servants in the gallery straightened as if someone had laid a hand between their shoulders and pressed with approval. A lady's fan stilled. A gentleman with a talent for witty cruelty closed his lips around a phrase and swallowed it, finding it tasted worse going down than he had expected. The word wife moved differently through the air than other words. It landed. It stayed. A footman at the far door, hearing it, set his shoulders as if he had been given clear orders for once. Mr. Priest's cough ceased to be a cough and became a small declaration. Bryony's eyes shone like a person who has been told she may keep something she loves. Verity inclined her head as if blessing an altar boy who has managed not to trip. "Of course," she said, "we are all cousins in kindness." The sentence was so deft that it allowed everyone to pretend she had meant no harm. This is what the clever learn to do when they are opposed in public, by a force they cannot wound without wounding themselves. Eleanor let the breath out slowly. the way one ought when the bucket returns full and you must not spill. She turned to the nearest servant, a girl with a tray of tea that had cooled, and said, "Thank you, Anne, would you please ask for hot water?" and looked only at the girl while she spoke. The girl's chin came up an inch. This, too, was part of refusal. The room learned. The conversation resumed, not sure of itself, like a horse that has been checked and must remember how to go forward, without renewed foolishness. A man began a story about a hound. A woman answered with a cousin's cold in Bath. The levee, deprived of its favourite toy, made do. From the corner of the room where the sun did not quite reach, Osric Vale detached himself from a tapestry pattern of courtiers and came to stand near Verity. His smile had not changed, but something beneath it had gone hungry. He bent a fraction toward her so that only those who wished to hear would. "If the old story breathes," he said, voice low and clean as a knife. "If the vow is true, the girl is the blade." The house learned a new silence after the levee. It was the kind in which people do not speak but move their faces as if speaking in private to their own pride. Eleanor went back to the East Tower with Aunt Margaret, Bryony following like a small sloop in the wake of a larger ship. When they reached the landing, a square of paper lay against the threshold, no seal, no hand. Bryony stooped and picked it up with 2 fingers as if it might bite. She hesitated. "Shall I burn it, my lady?" "Not before we read what it wants," Aunt Margaret said, and took it herself. She unfolded it. The words were few, written in a hand that imitated neatness without possessing it. "Cheapest price," it read. The ink had blotted at the tail, as if the writer had been startled or pleased. Eleanor thought of the scullery girl's basket of linens, and of Tom with the broom, and of Mr. Preece's goose fat. She folded the paper along its crease and set it on the hearth. Bryony touched a taper and held it to the edge. The fire took it and made it nothing but a curl of black, then air. The next morning there were 2 such scraps, one on her breakfast plate beneath the napkin, returned to pasture, and one tucked like a joke into the lacing of her gown, where only Bryony's careful hands would find it. Bryony's mouth went thin. Aunt Margaret's eyes went flatter than the North Sea. "Do not touch them with your bare hands," Aunt said, and flicked one into the fire with a knife used for butter. "And do not memorize their grammar. That is a kind of contagion." Eleanor nodded. She pressed the knot at her wrist until the skin under it sang. "If a thing wants to be our supper and yet makes us sick when we eat it," she said, half to herself, "we do not call it food." "Good," Aunt Margaret said. "That is a sentence you can wear in any room." By noon news found them that did not wear ink, that a woman from the village had come to the back gate with chapped hands and a child on her hip, hoping for tallow ends, and had told Bryony's cousin's wife that the draper's cart had missed its day, and the miller's grain had been found late in the ditch with no hands prints on the sacks. Men at the alehouse said the road had forgetfulness in it of a sudden, and no one could say who had started the talk that the prince's new wife had saddled the village with her hunger. Eleanor felt the cold settle under her gown in a place heat could not reach. Aunt Margaret made a sound in her throat that women make when they are apt to pick up fire irons and set a room to rights. "This is not a mistake," Aunt said. "It is a plan." Eleanor went to the steward's office, where Mr. Preece kept order with chalk and mercy. She did not walk in. She stood at the door until he looked up and nodded her into the room with respect, then shut it with his foot because his hands were full of blankets for the servants' sick ward. "Mr. Preece," she said, and he heard the steadiness under her words. "Have the carts lost their way?" He rubbed his forehead with 2 fingers, then checked the motion as if it improvised disrespect. "I have had, difficulties," he said, choosing the word as if it were coin he must be careful with. "The men I trust are suddenly promised jobs in other houses if they persist in ours. A man who never loses his way has lost it twice this week. The draper says his wife has a cough which is very odd, as she sang in the church on Sunday." "Who speaks to them?" Eleanor asked. He selected another coin. "Those who profit from others' hunger," he said. "I cannot say more because I would be wrong to guess, and I will not be wrong about this." She thanked him, not because of what he had said, but because of what he had not. When she opened the door to leave, she almost collided with Captain Blackmore, who had paused there as if the corridor had put him in her path. "My lady," he said, eyes flicking to note Mr. Preece's blankets and the set of Eleanor's mouth. "Forgive me. I was sent to find the steward." "He is found," Eleanor said. "So am I." She hesitated, then took courage because the day demanded it. "Captain, May I ask you if the prince is well served where counsel is concerned? Blackmore's mouth twitched at one corner with no mirth in it. He is served, he said, which was the least and most one could say in such a place. Then we will serve him also, Eleanor said, and left him with that to weigh. In the afternoon she returned to the chapel. The book sat behind its stone as if it had never been moved. She lifted it out and sat with it where the light could reach the ink. The hand that had written had been steady even when the heart was not. She turned pages past the description of the wrong, the land remeasured until it lost itself, the promise made in a room with panelling and candles that had been snuffed before the words could be written, and came to a section where the ink seemed to sink deeper into the page, as if each stroke pushed hard. A vow, the writer said, not the kind a priest blesses, but the kind a person makes when the doors are shut and someone must be held to account. The prince who had done the wrong had knelt, perhaps truly, perhaps to purchase time, and had sworn to fear the day when the wronged woman's blood returned to the house unannounced. The vow had pleased no one and bound everyone. The writer did not bless it. She recorded it because it had begun to govern the hall like weather no one could find the sky to. Eleanor read the name again, the one her mother had taught her to spell in the kitchen with flour, the one that women at the pump had softened to kindness when they spoke of her mother's patience. It was in the diary, like a candle flame behind glass. She touched the page with the back of her finger. Her hand shook finally where no one saw. Footsteps came with purpose along the stone outside. She closed the book too quickly, ashamed of the sound, slid it home, shifted the stone. She stood and wiped her hands as if taking flour from them, and went to the door with her head up. Sir Rowan Blackmore stood there. He had not put on court clothes. He wore the uniform of the man he was, dark coat, sword at his side because he had to, steadiness because he chose to. He inclined his head. Lady Ravensfeld, he said, I do not under such circumstances seek ladies in chapels, but the circumstances argue for discourtesy. You may speak, Eleanor said. If I must tell you to lower your voice, I will do so. He respected the warning. I have no wish to frighten you, he began, and then looked at her face and adjusted the sentence. You do not frighten easily. Good. Then I will be swift. Councillor Vale has been at the market all morning in a fashion that does not require his shoes to touch earth. Men loyal to him have put it about that the prince wishes to show kindness to you beyond your deserts, and will therefore squeeze rents to do so. The men I would trust with coffers have been told that jobs await them elsewhere if they persist in their loyalty to priests. Deliveries have acquired an unfortunate tendency to wander. This is an invisible riot. Eleanor felt the knot. She pressed it. He hopes the village will demand my dismissal, she said, not asking, stating. Then he will be the man who calmed trouble he started. Just so, Blackmore said. He did not praise her for seeing it, because he did not think it praiseworthy, only necessary. I have brought proof of some of it to the prince. He knows. He will act where it is his realm to act, but there is another realm. He shifted as if the words tasted worse than they sounded. There is a story, my lady, a story older than the prince. I am not a man to credit stories until they dress themselves in facts. This one has begun to do so. Eleanor held his gaze. I have read a piece of that story, she said. I will not say where I read it or from whose hand, because it would put stones in the shoes of people who have done nothing but leave doors ajar. But I have read enough to know that fear has lived in this house long enough to become furniture. Blackmore's mouth tightened into approval, unchecked by surprise. Then I need not shatter illusions that do not exist. The vow, then. It has made timid counsel of men who should be braver. Vale wields it without believing in it because it frightens others into believing. He intends to prod this whisper into roar, and then fix it with the prince's humiliation as the nail. Eleanor asked, because she needed to hear a soldier say it. What stops a whisper? Truth spoken with care, he said, and sometimes a hand on a wrist at the right moment. The prince does not fear you. He fears breaking what he thinks he holds together by holding too hard. Blackmore's eyes went to the chapel door and back, respectful of secrets he had not been told. I will keep watch where swords are useful. You may have to speak where swords are not. Aunt Margaret had come to stand just inside the passage, silent as a sister in a house where silence is a law. She said when Blackmore had gone, he is an ally, and we will not make a hero of him for being a decent man, but we will use the decency he offers. Eleanor leaned back against the cold stone. "If I speak, I topple a throne," she said, feeling the words measure themselves in her mouth. "If I stay silent, I condemn a heart. Perhaps two." "You cannot topple a throne with a truth spoken with love," Aunt Margaret said, not piously but as if naming a law of physics. "You can topple a lie. Thrones built on lies ought to fall. This house is not built on one lie. It is built on many truths and one fear. Speak to the fear. Speak to the people who use it. Do not speak to amuse the ladies." Eleanor nodded. Her calm felt like a piece of wood that floats because it must, not because it pleases water. That evening the prince sent for her. Not gravely, not ceremoniously, only a note, neat, the handwriting firm, sent by a boy whose mouth had custard at the corner. Eleanor went to the smaller of the studies, not the great one with oak carvings and history, but a room where a man wrote letters when he did not wish to be seen writing letters. Adrian stood at the desk, sleeves pushed once up and then regretted, pushed back down to the neatness he seemed to think would keep the day from fraying. He looked tired in the way a man looks when the edges of his patience have dried and cracked. "Vale wants the compact annulled," he said without embroidery. "He thinks the court will like the sound of it better than truth. He says it would calm the village." "And you?" Eleanor asked. "I am minded to have him eat his own words for supper," he said, the faintest heat in his tone. "But I am told this is not politic." He looked at her, and the tiredness in his face was not only his. "I am also told that my temper is a drawer which I must keep shut." She almost smiled, finding the rumour reduced and placed where it belonged. "Drawers are for things one wishes to keep," she said. "Your temper is not such a thing, nor is mine." He studied her as if measuring whether her steadiness would endure if the room moved. "There is an older matter," he said, "one that I will not name here. I will say only this. If it is to be spoken, it ought to be spoken by one who does not intend to use it as a cudgel." "It will be spoken," Eleanor said, "but not to punish, to make a path for both of us." Something in his face let go without collapsing. "Then I will stand where you stand," he said simply. "Even if it costs me." He looked down at his hands as if surprised to find that they were empty. "I will not let you be made sport," he added with a humanity that made the room warmer by a degree. "Nor you," she said. That made them partners in a way ledgers could not record. She left him with that promise, and the promise left her with a place to put her fear, next to his, on a shelf under a lock both held keys to. Late that night, Eleanor and Aunt Margaret sat with the diary between them, not reading now, but thinking, which is another kind of reading. Bryony had been sent to her bed with a sternness that admitted her usefulness and acknowledged her exhaustion. The fire had settled. The castle's noises had turned to the small unself-conscious talk-houses, make about their own bones. "We will not go looking for a stage," Aunt said. "But when one is thrown up and garlanded and the lanterns lit, we will not stand behind it and whisper either." Eleanor had no wish to play a heroine. Heroes often died of it. She had a wish to undo something that had been tied badly by people who were dead and yet still pulled strings. "Where will they make their stage?" she asked. "Where masks are allowed," Aunt said. "It is easier to lie in a guise. Easier to tell truths too if one chooses it." As if an answer had been waiting at the edge of the carpet, a sound came from under the door. Not a knock, a slide. Eleanor looked up. Something lay there, gilt catching the firelight. Bryony would have scolded the draught and stuffed a rag under the crack, but Bryony slept. Eleanor rose and lifted the square of card, thick, heavy, perfumed with a smell like crushed violets and cinnamon. The seal on the flap had been pressed with a device that made her think of Osric Vale's hands, tidy, pleased with themselves. She broke it. The script inside had the elegance of a man who had practiced with a tutor and learned to sign his name as an argument. The winter ball, masks required. Snow pressed its face to the windows and fogged the glass where iron met pane. The orangery at night was a world with its own weather. Warmth breathed from the flues under the flagstones. The leaves of the orange trees made a low whisper when the draught ran its fingers through them. Lanterns hung at intervals, their light turning the fruit to small suns, their scent a memory of summers no one here had lived. Eleanor came because the house had filled with paper and people and plans, and the weight of thinking had made the walls too near. The heat laid a hand on her cheeks and smoothed the cold there. She unfastened her cloak and let the hood drop. Her breath softened. She stood under a bough bent with green fruit and listened to a drip in the far corner where a gardener had set a pan to catch a patient leak. The rhythm steadied her, as a bell would. Footsteps approached, not stealthy but careful, because certain rooms insist on courtesy. She turned and found Adrian between rows of citrus, his coat unbuttoned after a day of pretending to be made of the same cloth always. Snow clung to his shoulders in a constellation that did not melt at once. He looked less like a figure on a coin, and more like a man who had put off one shirt and not yet found another. "I did not intend to intrude," he said. "I make truces with the light in here when my head misbehaves. The gardeners have tolerated me for years, as one tolerates a cat that has learned the way to warmth." "You do not intrude," Eleanor said. The heat made frankness easier. "I came to make my breath mine again." He came nearer and stopped when the etiquette between them said stop. They were close enough to see sickness and health in the other's face, and far enough not to be the subject of opera. Snow had left one curl damp at his temple. She had the sudden unbidden thought that she would like to push it back, to see if it would stay or rebel. He glanced at the fruit overhead, as if speaking to trees made confession safer. "I am told I am feared," he said. "I suppose I am. A man who must break the day into pieces and swallow them without complaint learns to be sharp with his own mouth. I do not take pleasure in it. I have been given a temper as one is given a sword before one understands cutting. I have at times cut what I meant to defend. People learn quickly to be quick with me. They also learn quickly to be cruel when they think they can be," she said. "You are not the only blade in this house." He considered that, and gave a small breath that might have been a laugh if it were not so weary. "Do you know what I fear?" he asked. "The thing I would not say in a room with anyone else in it." She waited. The fruit above them cast a ghost of color on the floor like a lantern that had decided to lie down. "I fear failing in private," he said, "in rooms where no one would judge me for it, only be hurt by it. I fear the rooms where my restraint ends and my inheritance begins." He gestured, not grandly. "They say I have a drawer where I keep my temper. I wish I did. I have a heart that learns too late which blows land where." Eleanor did not make comfort a trick. "I found a book," she said, plain. "In a wall that wished to forget it kept anything. I read words written by a woman who could not speak aloud what would have broken her if kept. I do not know her name. I do know the story. A prince swore a vow that fear would be his portion when a certain blood crossed his threshold again. He did wrong and promised fear as penance. Fear is a poor penance. It never finishes paying." His face altered, not in shock, but in the recognition of a door one has known in the dark and now sees by daylight. He did not ask where or how. He did not reach after the secret as if it were a lure. "It has ruled men better than I for longer than I have had time to make mistakes," he said. "I have let it shape decisions I should have made larger. I do not know how to unmake a spectre in a room full of eyes." "By asking it to take a seat where you can see it," she said. "By speaking first, not with blame, with history, with restitution, with a promise that does not require fear to keep it company." She swallowed, because speaking of restitution as if it were simple required courage she had not known she had. "The village should not pay for our truth. They should be fed by it." He watched her, as one watches a path appear underfoot, where one had expected a bog. The scent of orange flowers earlier in the year had sunk into the soil. The warm air carried it up now in a breath. He was quiet long enough that she could hear the drip in the corner, count the seconds. "I do not want to order you," he said at last. "I am tempted often to do so simply to know where the edges of things are, but I do not want a wife who obeys because she is convenient. I do not want a bargain I did not make. I want you. If you will have me, if you will tell the truth with me, if you will tell it even if it costs me the admiration of those who mistake admiration for loyalty." No one had ever said "I want you" to her without also wanting something else more. It was so unfamiliar that her body did not know which breath to take first. She took the one that allowed speech. "I will tell it with you," she said, "but I will not tell it to ruin anyone. I will tell it to stop something from ruling us that has not earned the right. I ask one thing in return." "Name it," he said, as if the room were a court and he were a supplicant, which made her ache and resist in equal measure. "We speak together," she said. "We do not leave the other exposed. We do not hold the other's courage as a banner and then retreat. We speak as one thing, and when we have spoken, we do the work that words demand. Land set right, rents forgiven where they must be, names honored that have been lost in our dust. He looked up at the fruit, then back at her, as if drawing witness from trees that knew something about seasons and patience. Yes, he said, together. The words seemed to change the warmth by a degree. I will send for the papers we need. I will sign what must be signed. I will stand beside you when you say the name that frightens this house. She wondered if speaking the name would frighten her. It did not when she saw his face the way it was now, stripped of everything except effort. It is my mother's name, she said. It is the name women spoke in kitchens with respect and pity. It should be spoken in a hall with neither. Only truth. He reached for her hand and stopped an inch before it, as if remembering that touching is a vow, even in small things. She closed the distance herself and set her fingers in the space he had left. His hand was warm from the room and cold from the corridor. He lifted her fingers to his mouth and set his lips against her knuckles, in a touch so careful. She felt the discipline in it, like a prayer. It was not a claim. It was a promise that claimed him. Let us end what should never have begun, he said, voice low. By beginning rightly. By beginning rightly, she answered. The words sat between them like a bench. They could both rest there. Outside the glass, snow stuttered in a sudden gust, and then settled back into the patient fall that makes morning certain. The drip in the corner continued its work. Somewhere in the house, a clock marked the quarter hour, and Eleanor thought of the chapel bell answering it in smaller voice. The world had patterns she could trust, even when people did not. They spoke then, not as conspirators, but as two people who intended to be married. Where to stand at the ball so that the words would carry without seeming forced. Who would speak first? How to bring the village into the room without dragging them behind a horse to be stared at. He would announce the acts that would be done. She would speak the story as history, with the diary's voice in her throat without making the diary a weapon. Will you be afraid? He asked. Not to test her, but to know what companion he would be to her fear. Yes, she said, and was surprised that the word did not diminish her. Not of the truth, of the eyes that look for sport, of the hands that will make my words into ornaments for themselves, but I will not be made sport. That is my rule. He smiled then, fully for the first time since she had known him, and the smile altered his face into a thing that could be loved without effort and respected without fear. I will help you keep it, he said. I make a rule of my own. I will not allow my fear to decide for me in rooms where love might. The moment did not ask for more than it had been given. Still, the body wants what rituals bless. He set his forehead briefly to the back of her hand, and she laid her free palm against his cheek, as one might calm a horse, not to command it, but to remind it of the fence, the field, the hand that would not strike. Their fingers parted. The air felt different after such a small vow. They stood as if listening for a verdict from a jury that was, in truth, only the night. I will see you at the ball, he said, as if saying it aloud would keep the days from shifting beneath it. Wear what you please. Wear what tells the room that you are not dressed by it. I will wear what lets me breathe, she said, and shoes I can stand in. He laughed softly. It made the leaves above them rustle as if approving. He left first, because if they left together, someone would make a story of it, and better that this particular story be born under chandeliers in formal speech. The heat filled the space where he had stood, and then thinned. Eleanor put her cloak back on, lifted the hood, and stood a moment longer to let her lungs fold themselves around the shape of courage she had chosen. A sound came then that did not belong to flues or drips, or the small scurry of a mouse behind fig roots, the whisper of silk, where silk chose to whisper, the soft adjustment of a fan against a palm. Eleanor turned her head toward the far end of the orangery, where the trees stood closer, and the lantern burned lower, uneasy. Behind the last bank of orange trees, someone shifted, and in the half-shadow a pale face caught the light like a coin. Verity Ashcombe's eyes shone with a brightness that did not need lanterns. In her gloved hands, half hidden and yet not hidden at all, lay a leather-bound book with a broken clasp, and a ribbon marking a page that had been waited for. The winter ball arranged itself as if it had been dreaming in the rafters all year, and now woke hungry. Chandeliers burned down into crystal that multiplied light until it became a kind of snow. Musicians tuned in the gallery. The first notes threaded the air like a needle. Masks bloomed, velvet, lace, feathers that had never known a bird. Men's coats gleamed, women's skirts spoke in languages made of silk. Eleanor stood at the top of the stair with Aunt Margaret a pace behind, Bryony somewhere near the door with a tray, her eyes bigger than they had any right to be. Eleanor's dress was not a challenge, not a surrender. It was a deep winter blue that kept its own counsel. Her mask was simple, cut to fit her face without asking it to be someone else. She could breathe in it. Her shoes were made for standing. Prince Adrian waited below with a mask that covered less than most men wore, as if he would not hide more than necessary. He looked up when she came into the room. The look steadied her, not because it promised a fairy tale, but because it promised that he would not go where she did not. Osric Vale moved through the crowd like a man walking his garden, touching each plant that would please him later. Verity Ashcombe shone in ice blue, her mask a frost pattern pulled from a pane. She carried nothing in her hands, which is not the same as carrying nothing at all. Dances began. Eleanor stood through the first, with Aunt Margaret watching from a chair against the wall, her palms flat on her knees the way women set their hands when they are ready to rise quickly. In the second dance, Adrian took Eleanor's hand, their palms touching in a public vow anyone might pretend not to see. They did not flirt with their steps. They moved like people who know they will have to move through worse weather and are saving their feet. Between measures, the room's whispering collected and dispersed, a tide with opinions. A masked gentleman murmured a jest about cows to a masked lady, and then looked over his shoulder as if expecting consequence. It did not come, and he found himself dissatisfied by his own bravery. At the height of the hour, when the candles had burned into the middle of themselves, and wine had made certain men think they were cleverer than hunger, Verity clapped her hands together softly. The gesture drew attention, without seeming to demand it. She stood near the dais where a small table had been set, with a book for guests to sign, and a pen that looked unused. She inclined her head the way one does when about to bestow a kindness. "Friends," she said, letting the word do work it did not deserve, "we must have a diversion while the musicians rest their fingers. I have found a little history, and as we are all friends to truth when it is well told, perhaps we may have a reading." A murmur rose, the agreeable sound that rooms make when fed a sweet they expect will taste of someone else's scandal. Osric's smile found its shape and held. Verity drew from behind the flowers at the edge of the dais a book that had lived in stone. The broken clasp winked. The ribbon trailed like a tongue-tasting air. She opened to a marked page with the reverence of a thief who believes herself a priest. "It seems," she said, "that Ravensfeld has kept in its walls the most interesting of vows. It would be unkind to deprive the house of its story." She lifted her eyes and let them fall on Eleanor, with pity shaped into a blade. "Our new lady is so fond of truth. We shall all be." Aunt Margaret's hands did not move, but the air around them did. Eleanor walked forward as if she had meant to all along. She did not hurry. She did not let anyone help her ascend the single shallow step to the dais. The room's sound fell back into its chest. She reached the table. Verity turned the book as if to present a head on a platter. Eleanor did not touch it. "Thank you," Eleanor said to Verity, in the tone one uses at supper when the salt is passed without being demanded. "You are kind to offer a history. I will read it, in my own voice." Verity's smile held. "By all means," she said, "if you can read it without your hands shaking." There was laughter. It did not last. Eleanor turned from Verity to the room. She removed her mask and set it on the table, not as a challenge, only as housekeeping. Her face looked like itself. She could feel the ribbon at her wrist press her skin and kept her hands open. "I will tell you a story," she said. "It belongs to this house, and therefore to me. It belongs to others who could not afford to be here tonight, and therefore to you." She paused long enough to be sure they had come closer with their attention. Long ago a prince wronged a woman. Not with hands, with paper, and with pride. He took land that fed her people. He made a promise in a small room to make it right, and did not carry that promise into the hall. Because he feared the hall more than he loved justice, he then swore a vow to a witness that he would fear forever the day when that woman's blood came back into this house unannounced. She let the word fear rest where all could see it. The vow pleased no one. It did not mend the wrong. It only taught men to be ruled by a ghost of their own making. It taught counselors to whisper, and use the whisper as rope. It taught those who were hungry to be patient when patience was not piety, but punishment. It taught women to keep their mouths shut and write in walls. A stir ran through the ladies like wind through dry grass. Some put their hands to their throats. Some looked at their shoes, as if they had stepped in something and could not wipe it away by will. "The wronged woman's name," Eleanor said, and now she let her voice carry farther because some names require breath like sails require wind, "was the name my mother taught me to spell with flour on her table. It is the name her friends softened when they spoke of her because they liked her and pitied her. It is my name as much as Hartwell is. It is why the vow shakes this house when I walk through it. It is why some would like me sent away before the pantry accounts must be unlearned." She spoke the name. It crossed the room like a light drawn slowly across a wall. Men felt it in their teeth, women felt it in their palms. Some servants in the gallery straightened as if the roof had risen an inch. Silence followed, not the silence of triumph, the silence of a thing being set down. Prince Adrian climbed the one step and stood beside her. He did not take the book from Verity's hands. He did not look at her at all. He took off his own mask and set it beside Eleanor's. He looked at the room and at the men who thought they loved him, and at the women who had made a game of their own loneliness, and at the servants who had learned to bend without breaking. "What she says is true," he said. "It shames me because my house has been ruled by a fear meant for one man and carried by many. It shames me because men in this room have carried it for me when I should have done my own lifting. It shames me because it has been used to hurt where it should have healed." He did not pace. He did not thump the table. He spoke each sentence as if he had weighed it and would feed it to the room because the room was starving for something other than cleverness. "Restitution will be made," he said, "by my hand. Rents are forgiven in the parishes touched by the old theft. The land in question will be reviewed and restored where law allows, and where law lags justice, we will bring law forward. Her charter will be signed." He nodded toward Sir Rowan, who placed on the table a sheaf of papers with seals dangling, not sticky wax but work, to provide schooling for girls of that name and of their neighbours besides, and an endowment for widows whose husbands die with pride but no coin. The wronged woman's name will be placed in the chapel with the names men have thought more interesting. It will be honoured because it is true. He turned, found Eleanor's hand, and let the court see the untheatrical way he held it. "This woman, my wife, will not be made sport. If you wish to attempt it, we will instruct you in better uses of an evening." There was laughter at that, the kind a room makes when it has been given permission to become kinder without losing face. People breathed. Some found their eyes had watered and used their fans to move air rather than hide expressions. Osric Vale stepped forward then, because men who have built their houses on cleverness cannot bear a room that discovers another way to live. "Your Highness," he said, smile damp with reason, "what you propose is dangerous. Charity should be private. To parade it is to invite chaos. The village will believe it can extort the crown. Merchants will think their ledgers can be rewritten by tears. Your affection for your wife does you credit, but the crown belongs to more than a moment." Sir Rowan had been standing at the edge of the dais like a man waiting his order. He did not wait for it. He laid on the table another set of papers, ledgers that did not shine, their ink workmanlike and unforgiving. He spoke with the blunt courtesy of a soldier. "Councillor Vale, I have here accounts of payments made through your cousin in the market, purchases of grain at one price and sales at another on days when the carts lost their way. I have letters bearing your hand in a clerk's script you have used before, promising positions to men who would cease theirs here. I have witnesses willing to swear to how messages moved from your office to men who prefer their meals paid for by other men's hunger." Osric's colour changed under the careful light. "This is an outrage," and he said, "You bring me ledgers at a ball." "I bring you what you understand," Rowan said. He looked at Adrian, not for permission to continue, but to be sure he would not be interrupted by mercy. "Your Highness," Adrian nodded once. "Councillor Vale is relieved of office pending inquiry," he said. "He will surrender his keys and his papers to Captain Blackmore. He will not leave the grounds until we have completed our reading." Silence met that. Shocked, grateful, frightened, pleased. The mixture rooms make when given justice in a dress they did not expect for the party. Osric opened his mouth and found nothing in it that would not rot on his tongue. He bowed with a stiffness that cracked when it moved. The room let him pass the way it lets out a draught, without regret. Verity had held the diary through all of this, as if it were a spaniel she could quiet by stroking. Now that the room's attention had shifted, she felt the weight wrong in her hands. She closed the book. Its broken clasp made a sound like a judgment. She looked at Eleanor. There was rage in her gaze and something like respect forced into the same space. She made a curtsy that had been practiced and left the dais. She did not flee. She did not win. She found a place against the wall and learned, perhaps for the first time, how to stand without a center. A murmur began among the servants and slid down to the floor like honey. The word moved. The name moved. In the gallery, a kitchen maid cried and laughed at once, and wiped her face on her sleeve because she had not a free hand. Mr. Priest set his cup down and did not pick it up again. He stood as a man stands at church when the hymn goes straight up and does not wobble. Adrian lifted his hand. "One more thing," he said, and the room stilled again. "The cow that has been made a jest will live in the south pasture and be tended as gently as any lady. Her milk will go to the poorest households and to the children who need it. And when she dies, she will be buried on the hill and not sold for parts we can pretend not to taste. Let it be said that we know what feeds us. Let it be said that we are not ashamed to be fed by it." The laughter that answered that was true. Some men looked at their wives as if seeing them feed a child for the first time. Some women looked at their hands and remembered what those hands had done before bracelets learned them. Music found itself again like a man who has dropped his hat and discovers it has been on his head. The musicians raised their bows and drew a line through the air that turned into a tune people could stand with. People moved softer. They came to Eleanor and Adrian with bows they meant. Some apologized without using the word. Some did not, and will never. It did not matter tonight. Bryony, ridiculous with joy, appeared at the edge of the dais with a tray that had nothing on it, because she had forgotten to put anything on it. She curtsied, remembered to breathe, and fled. Aunt Margaret came to stand where she could see Eleanor and the prince and the room all at once. She did not smile wide. She allowed one side of her mouth to consent to the evening. Her eyes were wet and did not apologize for it. Eleanor stood with Adrian's hand in hers, not squeezed, simply present. She felt the heat of the room travel up from the candles and down from the chandeliers and settle in her chest where breath lives. She looked at the book on the table, and then at the people who had been fed by its words, whether they admitted hunger or not. She thought of her mother's name in flour on a table, and in ink on a page, and soon on stone in a chapel. She thought of the village and the carts that would arrive on time more often, now that men had been told they would be seen. She and Adrian removed their hands then and stood side by side, unmasked. The court bowed. The music lifted, and the hall changed its mind about itself. Dawn came like breath on glass. Snow had laid itself thin in the night, a sift that made every stone sharper and every step deliberate. The small chapel smelled of beeswax and old wood, warmed again after long patience. Candles burned along the rail. No chandeliers here, only flame enough to make faces honest. Aunt Margaret stood with her palms on the back of a pew, her bonnet tied neat, her eyes bright with hours she had waited for. Bryony hovered near the door with a posy of winter greenery that had entirely too much pride for its size. Sir Rowan Blackmore took his place a little apart, as soldiers do, where he could see everyone and yet not intrude. Helena crossed the threshold with her cloak drawn close and felt the hush enter her bones. Adrian was already there, not in prince's cloth, but in a plain coat of dark wool, a white linen folded without fuss at his throat. He turned when she stepped into the aisle, and the look that met her contained nothing she did not wish to keep. He came forward 2 paces and stopped because stopping matters. She stopped as well. They stood in that small space between steps and felt the shape of their choice. "Good morning," he said, as if it were the first morning anyone had ever earned. "Good morning," she answered, and the sound of it changed the air. There was no priest. There was no need. Aunt Margaret had put the Book of Common Prayer on the rail in case anyone forgot how to speak promises, but the promises they would make had been written in the rooms of their mouths last night when they had found how to say together. They came to the rail and set their hands on the wood as if laying a tool where it could be shared. Adrian spoke first. "Steady." "Eleanor," he said, and the name had no title. I have been given fear and trained in restraint. These will not be my inheritance to you. I give you my hand and the portion of my courage that I have learned to keep for those I love. I promise to stand where you stand when truth must be spoken, and to be silent when silence will keep you strong. I will not hide you to keep peace, nor display you to keep favor. I will ask your counsel and heed it. I will temper my temper with your gentleness, until anger is no longer a draw, but a lesson folded away. I will not make sport of your heart. I will not permit others to. I will work with you until the work is no longer ours, because it has become the world's. She had not thought to cry. She found she had, and smiled at the silliness of her cheeks. She pressed her palm flat to the rail to keep from reaching for him too soon and spoke. "Adrian," she said, plain as bread, "I was counted as a price and walked anyway. I grant no one the right to name me but myself, and now you may name me as yours. I promise to speak truth with love when lies come dressed as duty, and to listen when my own pride is tempted to call itself righteousness. I will keep our home open to the people whose work feeds it. I will guard your quiet. I will remind you to drink your mint and to trust your own hands. We will make a vow that fear cannot keep for us and keep it ourselves." Aunt Margaret's mouth went soft as if it wanted a laugh and a prayer at once. Bryony sniffed and pretended she had a cold. Sir Rowan studied the floor with a care that might have been reverence. Adrian drew from his pocket a plain gold ring, the metal warmed already by his palm. He did not make flourishes. He held it like a small sun in winter. "If you will," he said. "I will," she answered, and held out her hand. He slipped the ring over the knuckle and down, the band finding its place with a certainty that felt like a prayer exhaled. When the cool metal settled, her heartbeat adapted to its weight as if it had always been waiting. She took a band from the pocket of her cloak in turn, as simple as his. "If you will," she said. "I will," he answered, and she placed the ring on his finger. It sat there, bright as good work done in light. They did not kiss at once. They stood with their foreheads close, and let the warm, ordinary miracle of breath shared do what grand gestures cannot. When they did meet, their mouths fit with the patience of two people who had used words to build the house, and now came inside. It was a kiss that knew it would have a lifetime to deepen, and made no hurry. Aunt Margaret cleared her throat in a way that made Eleanor bite back a grin. Bryony clapped once, and then hid her hands. Sir Rowan looked at the window, where morning had decided to show its face through a small triangle of blue. They left the chapel hand in hand. The day had brightened to the colour of tin warmed by touch. In the corridor, Adrian paused as if he remembered a small thing that mattered greatly. "Come," he said, and led her not to the great study with its carved stag, but to the smaller room where a man writes letters when he wishes the ink to be honest. He unlocked a drawer of ebony wood, its surface dark and old as lake water. He drew it open. Inside lay letters, yes, but not the kind that wound. The new charter he had promised folded and sealed, a list of names with amounts inked beside them that were not debts but gifts, a schedule of deliveries to the village written in a hand that could be read by any man who might have to carry it. "This," he said, "holds what needs guarding. There are no traps in it, only work. I would keep it with you." He took the small brass key from his pocket, the very one that had sung on rushes and made fear look foolish, and set it in her palm. He closed her fingers around it. "We keep this together." She swallowed. The metal was simple, not enchanted. It had opened a quiet prison once, it would open a better thing now. "Together," she said. The garden waited with frost pricked like stars in small grass. The south pasture lay beyond the low wall, a rectangle of white-greened field dotted with stubble from summer's hay. There the infamous cow grazed under a pale sun, her breath a faithful plume. Children had come as children always do when told they must not. They hung on the fence, hats askew, ears red, wonder uncivilized. A boy pointed and whispered, "That's the queen cow," and the girl beside him corrected, "It's the queen's cow, which is different," and both statements made the world kinder by an inch. Eleanor and Adrian walked to the fence. The cow looked up, recognized nothing and everything, and came with the unhurried certainty of creatures who do not pass rumor. Eleanor reached out and laid her hand on the broad forehead. Warmth met skin. The bell moved and made its small song. Somewhere the kitchen heard it and believed for that moment in feasts. "Shall we keep her name as she has always been named?" Adrian asked, amused. She has never needed a new one, Eleanor said, like certain people. He laughed quietly, and the sound laid itself over the morning as if it had always belonged there. The children stared, wide-eyed at a prince who laughed like a person. Eleanor beckoned with a finger. "Come," she said to them. "You may stroke her muzzle if you are gentle." They came in a spill of boots and gratitude, and the cow suffered them as queens suffer ambassadors. They walked on, along the frost-lined path where the ewes hid their dark myths and snowdrops had decided to be brave earlier than sense would suggest. Adrian's hand stayed in hers. It did not grip. It asked and was answered. Stone warmed under thin sun. The air pushed its way into lungs and made everything simpler. "Do you remember what you told me that first day?" he asked, mouth tipped as if toward mischief and toward apology. "Which part?" she said. "There were many braveries I did not feel. The one where you took what had been made to shame you and turned it into a sentence that fed the room," he said. "I learned to eat that sentence. It has changed me." "You changed," she said, "because you wanted to. Sentences are only spoons." He stopped, turned, and took her face between his hands very carefully, as if it were a glass he meant to carry a long way. "I want," he said softly, and the want in it was not hunger, but a vow. "I will keep wanting rightly." She closed her eyes for a breath, and then opened them because she had no wish to miss this day. "Then so will I," she said. "We will be wanted rightly, and we will want rightly, and the world will be better for it where it can and should be." She laughed a little at herself. "Hear me making promises for a planet." "You have already made good most of them," he said. "The rest will come by mornings and bread and the occasional battle." They kissed again, in clean air, their breaths condensing and mixing like small banners. It did not feel like a conclusion. It felt like weather, steady, with kindness in it. They lingered there until the cold reminded them they had a house to warm with the ordinary ease of living. Inside, people had begun to discover their new tasks. Mr. Priest stood with his chalk and mercy and directed a pair of teamsters to the yard. They went without argument, because the argument had been taken from their mouths by a charter with wax seals. Bryony dashed through 3 rooms, carrying nothing but good news, and got told off by Aunt Margaret for running anyway. Joy does not excuse a sprained ankle, which is a rule as old as kitchens. Sir Rowan sent riders to the market with letters in plain language, not law. Verity Ashcombe, that quick mind untethered from its old sport, stood at a window a long time, and then turned and asked a maid her name, and listened to the answer without making a picture with it. Osric Vale occupied a room with only a table in it, and learned what men learn when no one is brought to admire them. Eleanor and Adrian climbed the stair to the eastern landing, where winter light made diamonds on the floor. In their chamber, the fire laid a gold upon the linen and the low chair by the grate. Eleanor set the key on the mantel. Adrian set his hand on the small of her back and then removed it with care, remembering the promise to let choices lead. She turned and took it and placed it back exactly where he had put it, because the point of restraint is not to diminish, but to make room for consent. They sat side by side and talked in that rambling way 2 people do after the thunder has passed and the earth wishes to say her piece. Their plans were not grand. They were a list one could put on paper and assign to names. Mint, to be grown in winter pots. A reading circle to be held in the scullery on Sundays when the boots were drying. A visit to the Price cottage before the river rose. Letters to be sent to the parishes with coins and apology, both inside. When the light crept higher and the day asked for ordinary clothes, they rose. Eleanor touched the ring as one touches a pulse. Adrian laid his palm over hers, shared the beat, and laughed once at the wonder of 2 humans making a world. They walked the corridor. The portraits on the walls, the men who had drawn in their lips at truth and the women who had held their tongues and written in walls, seemed to soften by a paintbrush's breath. Windows let in the cold and the sound of a bell in the yard, the cow's bell, the chapel's bell, a boy striking a pot for fun. It all counted. "If you are listening," Eleanor would have said to the room and to the time that watched it, "take this. People will set a price on you to make their sums neater. Let them. Their arithmetic is not your worth. Fear, dressed up as tradition, will tell you to keep old vows because they are old. Ask whether they are true. If they are not, speak with love out loud and do the work speech requires. The world does not turn on one grand gesture. It turns on mornings where you pour tea for a boy and learn his name, on a ring that is simple, on a key that opens not secrets, but shared labor. Then as now, the bravest love is the love that tells the truth and stays to build what truth unmasks. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you liked the most. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotion and life lessons. And before we go, we want to remind you that an exciting and heartwarming story recommendation will appear on the final screen. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.